If you think of the amount of time we spend in video games doing a specific activity, sleuthing is probably right up there with shooting, slashing, and turning off motion blur. Crime scene investigation lends itself to gamification. Collecting clues from a virtual environment and slotting them together to form a narrative makes us feel smart and accomplished, which is the recipe for a big dopamine hit, and that's probably why there are so many detective games, not just in the modern era, but reaching all the way back to the early days of computing where we had things like text adventures. Ask your dad. The point is, when it comes to gaming, detective work is as elementary as cartoon violence and the double jump. One of the most famous detective games is of course Noire, a Rockstar published gumshoe romp through the seedy underbelly of 1940s Los Angeles that was notable mostly for a hugely innovative interrogation system which relied upon an experimental form of facial performance capture, which kind of worked, but kind of didn't.
It's nothing personal. I'm just doing my job.
Nevertheless, it had such a huge cultural impact with its sumptuous recreation of a glamorous era that's so familiar to all of us, and its enormous cast of real Hollywood guy from that thing actors, that it's probably the game that most of us think of when we hear the phrase detective game. And so it feels like a natural cut-off point for this list. There is a before and after Noire for this genre, and it's the best games of the latter we're going to talk about here. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but if you think we've made a really egregious omission, please let us know below. In the comments, down there. Down there where you belong. Chinatown Detective Agency casts you as a freelance detective in near-future Singapore, a grand techno-dystopia where conspiracies abound and you end up collecting stamps for a rich person. There is more to it than that, though, honest. The stamp recovery escapade takes you Carmen Sandiego style all over the world, involving the gritty realism of having to book and pay for your own flights in a grim form of non-escapism that does at least reward you with grand pixel art vistas of the world's great cities such as Istanbul, Shanghai, and London. Leave it at, yeah. It's a game that often requires you to do your own research, googling, by presenting you with riddles and information gaps that need to be solved with real-world general knowledge, and it really makes you feel like a proper sleuth as a result, along with its episodic format, overarching storyline, light life management gameplay, and a gorgeous overall aesthetic that feels at once futuristic and retro, but not retro-futuristic, that's a different thing. It's regularly on sale, this one, and it's well worth your time. The thing about the sea, right, is that it's terrifying. You don't need to invent anything supernatural to make it scary as hell. It's already full of horrible stuff, and it genuinely drives people insane, which is largely why Return of the Obra Dinn is a deeply tense and unsettling experience, even though you're not directly experiencing the bad stuff. You're merely piecing it together dispassionately as one of those most banally English of professions, an insurance assessor. This isn't a straight historical game. There are fantasy elements, chiefly in the form of your special pocket watch that allows you to peek into the moment of a person's death, like taking a thin slice of time itself and examining it under a microscope. Despite this magical conceit, which makes for a very cool gameplay mechanic, it does feel largely authentic to the golden age of sail. And in a meta sense, the game is a loving retro throwback to the early days of home computing, with an art style reminiscent of the dot matrix monochrome graphics of those first generations of Apple computers that so many American game developers cut their teeth on. A love letter then to two distinct eras of history, as well as a gripping mystery that plays out like filling in a Panini sticker book of gruesome ends. Scene Investigators is an immersive crime scene simulation within a simulation, casting you as a trainee investigator tasked with solving a handful of grisly mysteries based on meticulous examination of their recreated crime scenes. With no hand-holding or obvious clues, you must analyse every detail, piece together fragmented evidence, and reconstruct the story behind the crimes. Your aptitude and progression is measured in the form of exam questions, which you should, in theory, be able to deduce the answers to based on the available evidence. However, it's perfectly possible to solve the cases while getting a few of these exam questions wrong, leaving you locked out of a final 5th stage that you can only get access to if you 100% every quiz, which is frankly comically brutal. I mean, it's billed as a detective game for fans of the true crime genre, but it's plainly aimed at masochists. Subjecting yourself to a simulated job interview with 5 stages, the last of which requires you to jump through so many hoops that it's practically already a full-time job? Where's the escapism in that? That's just like trying to find a staff job on a games website. Still, if you want an experience that actually makes you feel like a detective and not just someone checking off data points on a quest log, you could do a lot worse than Scene Investigators. After umpteen thousand games following a classic and familiar Holmes and Watson, that is, middle-aged, well-established at 221B Baker Street and very clearly modelled on the definitive Jeremy Brett series, Frogwares hit us in 2021 with a next-gen reinvention of the character that revealed his years as a young, fledgling consulting detective on the Mediterranean island of Cardona, a sort of composite of places like Crete and Malta with a heavy dash of Gibraltar thrown in. Yes, the game is set during the height of British colonialism, but don't let that put you off. You get to hang out in a nice hotel, help out the police, dig around in Sherlock's own family history, and even dabble in a bit of horde mode, because for some reason they put shooting in this one. But hey, studios have to try these things. Missteps and a distinct lack of Watson aside, with that part being filled in by an imaginary friend revealing that Sherlock apparently fantasises about being mates with someone who's in the Bullingdon Club, Sherlock Holmes Chapter 1 is crammed with cases big and small to get solving, replete with barmy set pieces such as a delightful early sequence set around a typical Victorian-era seance. This is a series that's often overlooked, so if you haven't checked out the likes of Crimes and Punishments, The Devil's Daughter, and even all the way back to Sherlock Holmes vs. Jack the Ripper, you owe it to yourself to step into a most ambitious and endearing adaptation of Conan Doyle's works that can stand proudly alongside the likes of the aforementioned ITV show and the BBC Radio 4 series, both of which are considered definitive by people who are correct. And me. Don't bother with any of the ones before Jack the Ripper though, because they're The late Rutger Hauer lends his voice to Daniel Lazarski, a neural detective equipped with the ability to hack into the minds of others in Observer System Redux. Set in the late 21st century in the decaying tech dystopia of Krakow, Observer sends you on a mind-bending fact-gathering mission through a rundown apartment complex full of broken people just trying to survive in a broken world. The sense of place is astounding. Observer's world is a photorealistic safari of decades hence urban decay that feels properly lived in and is full of tactile tech that feels entirely believable. But this ultra-realism comes coupled with the kind of MS-DOS powered techno-thriller plot that wouldn't have felt out of place in a 90s hacker movie. It's a fairly linear experience that you can't really mess up, but its heady mix of Johnny Mnemonic and The Big Sleep makes for a vibes-based gem of a game that is well worth playing at least once. And don't listen to the people moaning about the stealth bits, they're fine. As long as you can wrap your head around the concept of hiding behind an office divider, it really shouldn't present a problem, and if it does, that's a skill issue, baby. Frog detective. You're a frog, but also a detective. Frog detective. Frog detective. Frog detective. It's pretty Ronseal, to be fair.
It does exactly what it says on the tin.
The passion project of a one-man dev team from Bristol, Shadows of Doubt is an entirely procedurally generated gumshoe simulator in which you solve procedurally generated crimes in a procedurally generated city full of procedurally generated people. Think of it as a cross between Blade Runner and Minecraft. You're given a generous amount of tools for interacting with the world, and also scanning and logging it, pinning clues to an ever-present caseboard, from obvious stuff like notes with phone numbers written on them, to scanned fingerprints, and even shoe sizes. You can hack local telephone exchanges, meddle with security systems, hack into office computers after dark, all in service of finding those data points that will allow you to find the perp, or save the kidnapped victim, or recover the lost heirloom, among other mission types. It certainly isn't for everyone, and its total commitment to its entirely emergent nature means that it doesn't work perfectly all the time. Some cases that the game generates turn out to be unsolvable due to missing clues or clashing NPCs, for example. It's also not terribly well optimised, sometimes struggling on consoles and even high-end PCs, but it is worth persevering through the jank because those emergent stories often produce heart-pounding results like the baddie turning out to be your next-door neighbour, or ending up in a race against time to find a serial killer before another victim is found. Failing and feeling genuine guilt because you didn't solve the case quickly enough. It's the kind of game that could only come from a small team, something unwaveringly dedicated to a particular idea, unwilling to compromise on its core vision to the point where it is arguably compromised, but it's a marvel all the same, and definitely recommended by me, Jim Trenka, the author of this list. Perhaps less of a detective game and more of a simulation of life as Ozzy Osbourne if he worked in homicide, Disco Elysium is ostensibly about figuring out what happened to the victim of an industrial action lynching who turns up some days before the game starts, but is actually about the rapid decline of an amnesiac recovering from an apocalyptic bender, discovering the consequences of which forms a significant side plot in a tangled and winding narrative that is elevated and made iconic by the game's celebrated internal dialogue system, where divisions of Harry Dubois' psyche interact with you and provide situational insight subject to stat checks that ranges from the useful to the utterly deranged. This serves as a powerful tool for character development and decision making, and encourages players to carefully consider their actions and their consequences, making Disco Elysium a profound exploration of identity, morality, and the complexities of the human mind. And it's really easy to die from a headache in the first 15 minutes, which feels like a piss take when it happens, but is funny immediately after. Also, if it wasn't on this list, the local socialist society would send me a strongly worded letter. Are you happy now, Clive? I put it in. Stop asking. Pentiment was a ballsy move from Microsoft. At the time of release, it was pretty much their only first-party game launch going into Christmas, and that was definitely deliberate, obviously. The whole aesthetic is painstakingly modelled on the manuscripts and frescoes of the 16th century. In short, it looks like a silly cartoon, and you'd be forgiven for expecting a giant Monty Python foot to squash you at any given moment, but that doesn't happen because this is a seriously well-researched historical game about grisly murders during 3 distinct generations of life in a small Bavarian hamlet during the Protestant Reformation. It's a CAD file game for weird nerds then, which is why it was hands down my game of the year in 2022. This is a time machine fueled by the power of art, and a testament to the wit and wisdom of one Josh Sawyer, the creative director of Fallout New Vegas, who remains one of Obsidian's most eccentric auteurs, and absolutely infused this small wonder of the game with his clear passion for European history and knack for writing branching narratives that really do feel influenced by the player's choices, triumphs, mistakes, and simply not being present for key events. Each chapter of Pentiment runs on a daily timeline that moves forward a phase every time you do something that advances the narrative, usually finding a piece of evidence through exploration or dialogue. There's a limited number of things you can do in a day, and more leads presented to you than you ever have time for, and so it requires a number of playthroughs to actually get a complete picture of what is going on in this provincial backwater of the Holy Roman Empire. Every single creative choice in this game feels deliberate and considered. The dialogue system, for example, is entirely text-based and there's no voiced lines, and there's a good reason for this. The typeface of dialogue changes dynamically depending on several factors, such as your perception of an NPC's social status, something which can visibly change in real time as new information is revealed. And honestly, the first time it happens, it's jaw-dropping. The game is giving you cognitive feedback of a changed parameter in a way that only makes sense if you've been paying attention to minor artistic details. How often do you see that? It's bold, it's smart, it trusts the player not to be a complete div, and it's got a dirty, great ruined Roman aqueduct running through it, and is therefore, in my view, the greatest detective game of all time. That Batman isn't in.
Oh, Jim.
Sorry everyone, I promised Ian I wouldn't mention Batman.
You just did it again.
Look mate, it's really hard to do a list of detective games without mentioning Batman.
Stop it.